Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, Vernelia Randall discusses Dying While Black, Intergenerational Impact of Racism and Segregation. Vernelia Randall is Professor Emerita at the University of Dayton School of Law and editor of the Race, Racism, and the Law blog. Professor Randall presents her critical analysis of how the legacy of slavery and systemic racism continues to manifest in devastating health disparities affecting African American communities. She provides insight into the direct connection between historical injustices and contemporary health outcomes, demonstrating how the slave health deficit established centuries ago has never been adequately addressed through Reconstruction, the Civil Rights era, or modern healthcare reforms. Professor Randall offers a transformative vision for addressing these disparities through comprehensive reparations and healthcare civil rights legislation designed to repair rather than merely compensate for centuries of systemic harm. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that shapes the lives, health, and opportunities of tens of millions of racial minorities in the United States.
Thank you very much, Professor Z, for inviting me. Over the years, I feel like you're a close friend. We have stayed in contact. This is the closest we've ever met by Zoom, but I don't find that to be a problem. I appreciate this. Your work is outstanding, and I'm pleased to be able to do this with you and for the center. So what I want to do, and I'll put up my slides now because I'm a slide person, mainly because it helps me stay on track and helps me pace. So I'm going to focus on Black Americans, and I always like to start my discussion by making it clear that I'm not trying to build a hierarchy of pain. My own impression, there's a lot of reasons why I focus on Black Americans. One, I am Black. Two, I believe health is about a history. And that if you don't understand the history that people have come from, you can hardly articulate even a legal way of addressing the health and legal problems that someone is going to have. And I want to use COVID-19 as an entry point for talking about Black health, how we got that way, how we got to such an unhealthy state, and the failure of the legal system to be able to address that. I need you to give me some kind of clue, hand raising or something when I get close to maybe 10 minutes in terms of the time. So a lot of attention has been focused on COVID-19, and COVID-19 and the racial disparities that is occurring has focused attention on racial health disparities. But the reality is that those disparities exist widely. So for instance, at least when I put this slide together, it was reported that the rate of COVID-19 deaths for African Americans overall was about twice the rate of any other group. big caveats. Caveat number one is they didn't start collecting race data until late. And I'm very suspicious of that because my own experience with the Center for Disease Control and with state health departments, and race is a standard demographic information that you collect in health because it is a known fact that different groups, even different racial subgroups, have different health. And if what you plan to do is work on improving health, then you have to collect race data. So there's a big question as to why they went away from the standard method of collecting race data while collecting gender and age. So a number of states are not collecting data. And the other problem, part of my discussion is about Deas, descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States. And one of the problems we have is the data is not collected in a way where we can clearly separate what's happening to Deas versus immigrant Blacks, which is important. But for right now, I'm going to use the numbers that we have for all Black. And so that this racial difference in COVID-19 is startling. If you look at, and I don't read my slides. I pick up a few points and I assume that people are going to read them and ask questions later about them. I should point out that my slides will be available at patreon.com if you want a copy of them. So what you can see is that the COVID deaths, 70% of the actual deaths, not just rate, 70% of the deaths in Louisiana were to Black people, while Black people only represent 33% of the population. This kind of huge disparities, because it's one thing to say that Black people have a higher rate of death, it's another thing to say that they actually represent the higher percentage, the percentage of death of all the deaths, 70%, 40%, when they're only 14% of the population. So we know, all of you have heard, and we know that COVID-19 is having a disproportionate, significant impact on Black Americans. But these racial health disparities existed long before COVID-19. And COVID-19 COVID-19 is an infectious disorder occurring in real time. So for many people, this is the first introduction that they're having to Black deaths. But the reality is that excess Black deaths, that excess is a term of art. It means if you take a death rate of one group and apply it to a different group in health, how many extra deaths occur because they have a different death rate? 80,000 a year. 80,000. Think about that. I put up a crashing plane because if you wanted to visualize what 80,000 excess Black deaths per year would be like, what you're talking about is filling a plane up, a jumbo jet plane with nothing but African Americans, and crashing one every day. But that's not talked about because for some reason we don't really clue into statistical numbers. But it's important to remember that Black deaths are significant in every area. And I'm going to go through, one of the things I like to do is, instead of comparing us to just white people or Hispanic or Native Americans, I like to compare us to countries. Like, if we were a country, how would we compare? So in maternal deaths, which everyone is looking at right now, white Americans, and this is another thing that holds true, white Americans aren't doing all that well, given that we are the #1 nation in terms of military spending and income. When you say that white Americans have 9.1 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, and Black Americans have almost 4 times. 31.7, worse than Barbados, Costa Rica, Infant mortality rate, another way to look at how Black Americans are doing in this country. And when you look at 13.6, we would be 65th if we were a country, behind countries like Barbados and Chile. But the statistic that is most striking to me is life expectancy. The reason is years ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, when I was doing, maybe longer than that because it's in my book, and my book is from 2006. Years ago, when I was working on my book, I was looking up life expectancy, and I stumbled upon the CIA's site. And the CIA has a website up, and it's still up. At least was the last time I checked. And what they do is life expectancy, and this is a quote from them, is a measure of the quality of life in a country. The higher the life expectancy, the better the quality of life. So my thought was, well, okay, so let's look at that. What is the quality of life for Black Americans? Our quality of life is worse than Jamaica or Barbados or Chile, who have better life expectancy for males. For females live longer. I haven't found a country in which females don't live longer. Females, Black Americans' health life expectancy is worse than Barbados and Cuba, meaning that the quality of life in the United States overall is so significantly poorer than white Americans and than developed countries that if we were a country, we would be a developing country by the terminology that is used. So let's put COVID-19 within that context, within that perspective. It's an immediate problem that has to be dealt with. And I was a public health nurse that did infectious disease control in Alaska. And I can tell you they really have been messing this up. But we have a long-standing problems with of health issues for Black Americans. I bring up low birth weight. I want to get to this a little later, but I want to use it right now in this context because once I was told that if we didn't like it here in the United States, we could go back to Africa, using Africa as the name of a country instead of a continent, like it is, and we would be so much worse off. Well, the reality is, in the area of low birth weight, Black Americans have higher percentage low birth weight babies than many African countries. And so clearly something going on with us that goes way beyond COVID-19 and that needs to be addressed. So what do I think the primary cause of racial health disparities are? I think it's the intergenerational stress of slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination. And I want to take a moment here because and talk about what I mean by the difference between race and class, because I can guarantee you somebody is thinking, oh, there are more poor Black people, and being poor gives you a lower standard of living because you have less access to housing and goods and all kinds of things. So it's class that explains the difference in health. And I'm going to debunk that with some actual statistics, but I would first want to make sure that we have an understanding. I understand that race is a social construction and not a biological, not a genetic construction. But social isolation and racism has had biological consequences. And so poor Blacks are sicker than poor whites. That's the race analysis. When people say middle-class Blacks are better off than poor Blacks, they're absolutely right. But that's not a race analysis. You haven't said anything about race. What you said is class. And admittedly, class makes a difference for anyone. So the Akron Journal did a study and they found that low-income whites lived 3 years longer than low-income blacks. They found middle-income whites lived 10 years longer than middle-income blacks. Again, race makes an independent difference. And I want to go back to, you remember the slide on low birth weight, where there was many African countries that had low birth weight percentage than Black Americans. This slide, years of education is often used as a proxy for income. So this, and again, this information comes from Health United States, which is put out by the Center for Disease Control. So less than 12 years of education. So what you see is across income, when you say less than 12 years of education, Blacks have a higher percentage than whites. When you say 12 years of education, Blacks have a higher percentage than whites. When you say 13 or more years of education, Blacks have a higher percentage than white. So every level of class, the black people in that class have a higher percentage. And this goes all the way up the scale. For instance, Black people with PhDs and MDs have a higher percentage of low birth weight babies than whites with those same level. But what is striking is that poor whites have fewer low birth weight babies than Blacks with 13 or more years of education. So if nothing else, we should not get into a discussion of that the difference in health is a difference in class. So we shouldn't be talking about how people eat, because poor whites and poor Blacks eat the same or similar enough. They both, middle-income whites and middle-income Blacks eat similar enough. Exercise similar, the same. Go to the doctor about the same. Do all the things similar. So it's not a difference in behavior, it's actually a difference in environment. So what is that environment? Well, it's the historical deprivation and oppression. It's that has caused our communities to be depressed, to have embedded social racial inequalities, slavery, legal apartheid, which some people call Jim Crow, racism, which goes across, and currently neo-slavery. All of those things have embedded social and racial inequalities that affect communities, not just individuals. It affects in communities in health and income and education and criminal justice and everything in that list. And yes, then it affects, those then affect individual behavior. Oftentimes, people want to say, oh, well, if people just ate better, then they would have better health. And the truth is, on a one-on-one basis, it's maybe possible to get someone to improve their health, but the racial health disparities are due to embedded racial inequities. Lack grocery stores in communities, lack of hospitals in communities, lack of sidewalks, a lack of jobs, much lower pay for the same amount of education. There's an embedded racial inequality that is found in every area of life, and those affect the choices people make, and then those choices affect the choices they can make. So it's a vicious cycle. Until we get these and these are called social determinants of health. And this is a well-accepted health doctrine, that social determinants of health are more significant in changing population health than counseling on individual behavior. So I want to play this video real quick. It's a short because one of the things that happened is in the last 10 years has been a discussion of the impact of chronic stress on your biology.
Turns out if your mom was really stressed, congratulations, now you're stressed too. Thanks, oh mama. Back in 1998, an ice storm hit North America. And if you live anywhere near the Canadian border, you probably remember it. I do. It was crazy. Everything was covered in ice from Michigan to Maine and Ontario to Nova Scotia. The weight of all that ice caused massive damage to infrastructure in both countries, and power outages dragged on for weeks afterward. Not to be caught out in the rain, so to speak, researchers at McGill in Canada found pregnant mothers who were without power and followed them and their offspring for 13 years to see how it affected them. Turns out, the North American ice storm of 1998 affected the kids' DNA. It used to be thought that if I was physically stressed in my body, it wouldn't affect my kids at all. If I was in a famine, that my kids wouldn't be affected by that. And then it turns out that's not true at all. In the 1990s, the field of epigenetics came onto the scene, and we discovered what happens to our parents will affect us, and what happens to us affects our kids, and so on down the line forever. This study, published in PLOS One, found that the children of those mothers had, quote, distinctive patterns in their DNA methylation. DNA methylation is the on-off switch for how the DNA gives its instructions, whether to produce a bone or a red blood cell, for example, would have a different methylation. Alterations of that process change how the same DNA will be read by your body. In this case, a correlation appeared to exist between the length of time without power and subjective suffering of these mothers and the methylation of their children's DNA. 36 of the children tested showed the same pattern of methylation on their T cells, and that was the most stressed mothers. These cells are part of the immune system, so chances are the kids are going to have some kind of a different immune system response than their parents do. If you're wondering what that will mean, you're right there with the other scientists. Nobody knows yet. It's not like they can compare kids pre and post DNA methylation. They were born that way. But this is the first time ever in humans that science has been able to show that a single maternal stressor was able to affect the DNA of the offspring. Now that we know this happens in humans, we can go back into history and see what we can learn from these epigenetic changes. Using the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children in England, a study of 14,000 pregnant women, their husbands, and their children, who's been going since the 90s, they found that men who smoked during puberty, way before they sired a kid, birthed sons who were fatter than average, even fatter than those who started smoking later. Daughters were fine, by the way, but for some reason, the methylation affected the boys disproportionately. A different study found that a famine feast cycle in 19th century Sweden altered the DNA of kids born as late as 1905. So grandfathers who were overnourished just before puberty had grandchildren who were at risk of early death, which is freaky if you think about it. What about the Great Depression here in the States? How did my grandmother living through that affect me? What about the 9/11 attacks? That's a major stressor. What about going into space? How will that affect future humans and their epigenetics?
So the point obviously being made by here is that chronic stress affects your biological function. And we have had chronic racial stress. And so there's no surprise that COVID-19 is affecting Blacks more at a disproportionate rate, because chronic racial stress causes illness, and many of those illnesses are illnesses that are comorbidities for COVID-19. Cancer, autoimmune disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity. All of those are comorbidities for COVID-19, and all of those are disproportionately represented in the African American community and are related to chronic racial stress. So what to do? So first of all, I have to put a plug in here for reparations. I think we need to adopt a multi-generational, because remember, the research tends to show that it takes up to two generations for changes that happen to a body to because of stress to convert. Well, African Americans, descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States, have never been two generations without racial stress. In fact, they haven't been 5 years, 1 year, 30 minutes without racial stress. So whatever kind of changes that has happened to us has not only been reinforced, but has been added on. And so any attempt to repair that harm, the harm is the racial health disparities. Any attempt to repair that harm is going to mean multi-generational and trillion of dollars. And it's going to be a program, not a plan, not a study, but a program. And sort of like the program that said we're going to go to the moon in 5 years, we could say we're going to get rid of the health disparities in 30 years. And we're going to devote trillions of dollars to doing it. And so that's one thing that I think needs to happen. And to do that, we would have to deal with discrimination in wealth and income, discrimination in education. Every area of Black life would have to be addressed, and the discrimination that is occurring in that area would have to be eliminated. We'd adopt that social determinants of health approach. But we would have to get rid of chronic stress. And we'd have to get rid of chronic stress. And I think one way to get rid of chronic racial stress is to eliminate racial discrimination. Finally, to the law part, you say. So we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of the 1964 is an inadequate anti-discrimination law for the 21st century. I'm a beneficiary of this. The Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed when I was a teenager, older teenager, just about to graduate from high school. Every job I have gotten, I've been the first Black hired, and I am pretty sure affirmative action in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act was an important part in me getting the job. And I'm thankful that it exists, but it is not adequate for 21st century discrimination. On its face, it should be adequate. That is, it says, no person in the United States shall, I'm going to read this time, on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And in America, that financial assistance is broadly defined, and there's hardly any corporation, organization, government that is not receiving some federal assistance. The problem, though, is that the courts have interpreted that to mean intent. So you have to intentionally exclude. Now, intent is a very high standard because it's hard to prove people's state of mind and that's that level, whether they had actual desire to do it based on race. They had to intentionally exclude people based on race. The administration recognized this in 64-70, and they passed a regulation that allowed disparate impact to be defined as to be suable under Title VI, which should get at a lot of the problems. It's still not enough, but if we had disparate impact discrimination, it would help get at a lot of the problems. But there's been no direct access to the courts for, I think, maybe 20 years. I didn't re-look up the date, but approximately 20 years ago, the courts came down saying that because this was a regulation that an individual cannot sue in federal court under the regulation, all they could do is complain to the agency, and then the agency could decide whether or not they wanted to bring a lawsuit. Well, that turns disparate impact to a political standard. Imagine trying to get Trump administration, not to speak of Obama, Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton. None of them was as good as they could have been on enforcing racial discrimination under disparate impact. And because we couldn't go to court, it really is something that's become pretty quiet in terms of effectiveness in terms of getting rid of discrimination. The other problem is the legal system itself requires that you have an injured individual to sue. So what you have is a lot of people looking for that individual who knows that they've been denied access because of their race and wants to sue or has a good suspicion. And the problem is that's not the nature of discrimination this day. So most discrimination is going to be statistical to be able to prove that it exists. You're not going to be able to find a particular individual, because if that individual has that kind of evidence, then they could probably sue for intent. And it provides no right of action for community organizations. I believe that different community organizations should be able to collect the statistical data without finding an individual to sue, and to be able to sue for enforcement of the law. None of these things are found in Title VI. Why is that important? Well, the question I had that keeps coming to my mind is, why is that? Why is there no broad definition of discrimination in Title VI when in other areas of personal injury, like criminal law and tort law, there's a whole continuum? You have intentional tort, you have reckless tort, you have negligence tort, and you have strict liability. And strict liability is saying, basically, we don't care what your state of mind was. If you did the act, that's enough. Did you drive over 55 miles an hour? Don't care why, just as long as you was over. That's what strict liability is. You have that in criminal law and you have that in tort law. But we have not put that has not been done in discrimination law. And that's directly related to the fact that discrimination law, I believe, is racist. And before I get into a discussion of why it's racist, I need to define the difference between stereotypes, biases, and prejudice in presence of discrimination. And racism is when you may not have, and this is a lot of the 21st century racism, especially institutional and systemic racism, is not about someone taking an act because they intend to discriminate against Black, but someone taking an act that they know will discriminate against Black, but they have other reasons for doing it. And as long as they have other reasons to doing it, reckless reasons, negligent reasons, it's acceptable. It's not illegal. And so the primary form of systemic and institutional discrimination, racism, is a discrimination that doesn't point to a specific intent, but is either reckless in its impact or negligent in impact. And the law, it's legal. The law says that's fine. If we want to reduce the stress, and we go back to whatever the law does not forbid, it permits. So in the United States, racial discrimination is permitted. Reckless racial discrimination, negligent racial discrimination is permitted. And that makes the law itself racist. Because if you define racism as any policy, procedure, or practice that has the disparate impact, a negative disparate impact based on a marginalized group and race, then Title VI, for all the good it was, is now a racist law. It has gotten that way through interpretation and through the failure of anybody in the legal system, Democrat or Republican, to want to fix it. And this is the last part of my presentation. So I think it could be fixed, but racism and capitalism prevents a meaningful change. So about, a few years ago, I did a paper on fetal fetal alcohol syndrome and the need to allow communities to decide what was best for them in terms of how to deal with fetal alcohol syndrome. And this is Maslow's hierarchy of need, which many of you probably studied. I have looked at it as a hierarchy of community needs. So basically, the community needs, we focus on, when we talk about communities' needs, we're talking about focusing on the need of the community as a whole and not a particular individual. It's a step away from individual rights into community assessment. It's neither about the individual or about individual rights. It's about protecting the community as a whole, and that the community is only as well protected as the minority people in the community are protected. So every community has several levels of needs that, according to Maslow, that they're striving on. Physiological needs, which are hunger and clothing and personal comfort. Health and safety needs, which I think most of us are at now. Health, security, protection, freedom from fear and anxiety, freedom from chaos. Acceptance needs as a community. We want to be accepted as we are as a community, as an African American community. We don't want to have to assimilate and blend in to be recognized by the society at large. Esteem needs. We want to be valued. We don't just want to be accepted. We want to be respected, not just for basketball and entertainment. We want to be respected for all the things that we bring to this culture, and we want to be able to work on our self-confidence and strength. We want to have, as a community, a feeling of worth. And then the actual community actualization, according to Maslow, that is the highest level of fulfillment, is to reach actualization where you realize your full potential as a community, Afrocentric, Africana community. Now, the problem becomes that the functional level of the community is based on the resources needed to address an individual's basic needs. And so you have to look at how many people in the community are at the physiological level, because people are going to be spread all up and down that. And then the functional level, while may be at health and safety, if there's a disproportionate number of homeless in the community, it may just be at the physiological, food and housing. And so you look at that. And so a minority of individuals in the community can determine the community, the function of the community. The needs are hierarchical, and the community's pursuit of a higher need is impaired until a lower need is substantially met. I find that many people in my community seem to want people to function at a higher level when they're still trying to get the lower level met. And so we need to recognize that, because if we want to function at the community to function at a higher level, we have to bring everyone up, and we have to have laws that help us do that. So no community can become self-actualizing without health. So then I thought about, how does this play out in terms of what American society? So first of all, I believe most people in America, no matter how much they make, are working class. My definition of working class is someone who makes and sustains their lifestyles through some kind of employment or monies from other people. That's working class. And I put independent wealthy at the top, and outside of the human needs, because independently wealthy people, which I tried to get a definition of that, and the internet, of which I love the internet, said you need about $2.5 million that you generate independently without work from something to be independently wealthy. And that sounds about right, I guess. But the question, people move up and down. Lower income communities that have a lot of lower income people may have a lot of physiological needs that are going unmet. I think one of the things that has happened in the United States is while there used to be a clear distinction between working class who were middle income and working class who were lower income, that distinction is evaporating largely because of stagnant wages, employment situations that are not secure, and lack of access to health and safety. But at any rate, you can kind of think of this as looking at it, the class issue. So then I asked the question, okay, so how does this work? In terms of the American legal system, where does this American legal system fits in? So when I think about the American legal system—
Professor Randall,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to tell you that we're at the 10-minute mark.
Perfect, because I'm almost done.
Okay.
Thank you. The American legal system, when I say American legal system, I'm talking about federal, state, and local. I'm talking about executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. I'm talking about police. I'm talking about everything that's encompassed in all of those, okay? That's the legal systems. So the independently wealthy affects what happens in those systems, not the working class. And so then the systems then respond in a way to protect the independently wealthy. How does that happen? Well, for one thing, even though you may have judges and African American Black people who come from a lower income, initially they move up. Now, many of them move up without losing altogether their identification with the community they come from, okay? Some of them very strongly continue to represent the interests of their community. But to stay elected, to continue to raise donor money, to continue to be supported by the Republican or the Democratic Party, and the apparatus, they have to at least modify their value systems enough to not be a threat to the independently wealthy. And so what you have then is people who may come from all different kind of communities who may be vocal voices for their communities when there's an issue come up, but they're working within the system that is designed to give them little power. They can't force any change. They have to have the cooperation of other Democrats. They have to have the cooperation of their president. They have to have the cooperation of cooperation of whatever organization they're in. And so voice alone is not power. And what we see, what I put together is the independent wealthy sits outside of the human needs because they have enough money to generate whatever it is they want. And what they want is a capitalist racist system. And what they do is affect the parties such that whatever solution, so when you have a problem of housing in a community, a problem of health in the community, the solution is always something less than ideal because the independent wealthy is concerned about either individual rights, so they don't want anything that forces them to do something, and they don't want anything that is going to affect their income significantly. And this is both parties do this. And so what we get caught in, and I put capitalism, racism together because I know that for some, it's whichever one you think started the other, they are linked in the United States. There is no way to have a capitalist system that's not racist. There's a racism, you can't get a racism as long as you maintain capitalism. So the choice then that people are making within the context of this system and why this is ineffective is that for many people, they decided a reduction of harm is all the best we can do. And so they vote that. Okay, let's vote. We'll vote on a reduction of harm. Even though we know that, for instance, the Democrats haven't undone the intent standard in Title VI. And in the this was in the 90s, I think, I was advocating for them to try to put something in the healthcare law, healthcare reform bill, that was going to be strong and deal with this. And I somehow managed to get to someone who used to be an aide to Senator Kennedy. And so I think he thought he was saying something to me because he said to me, what you're asking for, not even Senator Kennedy would support. And I think he thought I was going to say, oh, okay, then I must be asking for too much. My immediate response to him is all you've done is lowered Kennedy's reputation in my eyes. Because if he won't support expanding the definition of discrimination so that all forms of discrimination are covered under Title VI, then he's not a true supporter of us, because that is what we need. And I don't know, maybe someone else can say, in the discussion we can get at whether this, I just don't know how you do this in a reduction of harm model. I think the only way to do this is to get rid of capitalism. And by getting rid of capitalism, and we get an opportunity. It doesn't say we're going to get rid of all of racism, because racism has built into the core of America's soul. But capitalism will get rid of the incentive to hog the wealth from everybody. But until that happens, I don't see how we can meet the human needs, which means that the reason we've taken ineffective approach to COVID-19 is because it is against the capitalist interest to take an effective mode. And this kind of thing will keep playing itself out like it has over the 50 years of my career. It'll be a reoccurring problem.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.